I'm Rachel Ravisky.
We are going to be supporting you and getting a lot of work done today. We also have Brittany and Laura in back. Brittany is the go-to person if you have something that you need, don't know where the bathrooms are, they're out to the left. Grab Brittany, well, not really grab her, but let her know. And Laura is going to be managing our Skype conversation today. So we learned a lot of lessons from the last workshop around how to make sure that we're inclusive. And we know the room is really, really tight. So if you need to step outside and get a breath of fresh air, I totally understand. I'll try not to do that when I'm in the middle of talking to you. So, okay. Rachel, do you want to share a little bit about the entry chart?
So if I could turn your attention over to our entry chart. It was our little icebreaker for those arriving. We just wanted to quickly capture and see the experience in the room. So on this axis, we have the amount of years you've been kind of in the energy sector doing energy work and the amount of years of experience you have with rulemaking. And as you can see, we have a couple of folks up here who probably deserve a prize around this corner. And it looks like we're kind of very concentrated in kind of the 10-year and below zone over here. So that was our quick way of kind of seeing who's in the room with us.
Can I ask a question? And you don't have to answer. I know which one Tony is, and there is a rival for Tony. And so who is like the far right, really, okay, Tony, there you go. There's your partner.
Garcia is the other one, yeah.
So thank you for taking the time to do that. It just helps us kind of see who else in the room, and it gives you really something to, chat with other folks about as you're trying to figure out where to put your dot. Today, in front of you, you have the agenda for the day. And what we're going to do is arrival and welcome. We gave you some time to settle in. And then the first thing we're going to do is talk about the rule language that we'll be discussing later today and see how that resonates with you and how we're looking at that language. So that's the rule workshop part of the agenda. Then we'll have a break. During the break, there's a coffee shop that's outside and down in the next building. You can go out the door and in. There's no security needed to get into the coffee shop. And we'll have if we get done early on the rule workshop, your break will be longer, but we have a really busy agenda. So we'll start up right again at 10:15. Then we're going to, Rachel's going to lead us through some work around getting input on the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions. And then we are going to do an ideation process around streamlining 9937 and CDOT. And so during that part, we really want you to get crazy and creative around ideas. It's not about prioritizing anything. It's just about coming up with really great ideas. Lots of them, or even bad ideas, but just a lot of ideas. And then we'll have wrap-up Q&A and send you on your way. So before we dive in, is there any questions on the agenda? Can you hear me in back?
It's pretty quiet back there.
Yes.
I will, man.
I know.
Whew. This is all new for us at Commerce, and so we're learning how to use it. On the back of your visual agenda, which is your takeaway, there's a place to capture notes. In the center of your table, you all have note cards and Sharpies and stickies that we'll use for the activities today. And with that, anything else, Rachel, before we go into the workshop?
No, I'm just adjusting the table for the camera. It stretches as far.
Okay,
It's fine.
it's okay. It's good. Okay, so, all right, so again, thanks for being here. And I would like to bring up here in a minute our guest and subject matter expert today. He's the manager of the Energy Policy Group here at the Department of Commerce, and he leads our transformation to clean energy. It's a good role for him because he's been lead staff at Commerce for the Energy Independence Act. He's worked with many of you in developing the legislative language, and he's anticipating that you'll have lots of great questions for him today. He's worked at Commerce since 2011. We've been really blessed to have him here with us. He brings a lot of excellent expertise, and he's just a really good guy. And so having said all that, and he also was the staff economist at the State Senate Energy Committee, and he was at the UTC. So please help me welcome our very, very, very special guest, Dr. Glenn Blackman. He's here today to discuss this important topic and to, yes.
You are.
So, you are. Yes.
guess this is what happens when you say, okay, somebody else can lead the meeting.
I think he asked me because he thought that I would be a little something else, but he hasn't worked with me in a couple years, so
That's right.
I've gone through my own transformation. Before we dive in today, I want to let you know that I'm going to be asking Glenn some questions to kind of help set the context and make it, help you understand what it is that he wants to really hear from you today. And then there are note cards, as I shared, on your desk. If you have a question that you want to make sure that you have a chance to explore with him, write it down. If there's something that you need to ask in the moment to really clarify what he's saying because he's speaking doctor, then just raise your hand. You do speak doctor, don't you?
I'll try not to. It does happen.
We'll also have our Skype folks be chatting in questions as well. So we're going to spend the next, until 10 o'clock on this. So without any further ado, I am going to ask you your first question.
Okay.
So, Dr. Glenn, tell us a little bit more about this EIA and this rulemaking process.
All right. Well, so for today, and I do want to emphasize that this is just today's body of work, and really even just the first third of today's work. We're looking at the rule changes that we need to make in order to incorporate what the legislature did for the Energy Independence Act. We've all worked on the Energy Independence Act for a long time now. It was enacted in 2006. It's been amended several times over the years. And anytime that happens, we as the agency that does the rules for the consumer-owned utility side of the EIA, we need to incorporate that into our rules. Sometimes it's not any big deal. It's really clear what the legislature was doing in the change. Other times it's even deliberately vague. There'll be some sort of recognition that we need to make a change, but the details need to be worked out in rulemaking. So the last couple of sections of the Clean Energy Transformation Act are another one of those where we've got a couple of amendments to existing law, and we need to incorporate the rules, that into our rules. And we wanted to do that right away because those changes will take effect in 2020. Everything else, it's further down the road. But those last two sections, they come into play almost immediately here. So we're trying to get our rules lined up with the new statute.
Great. And so you all have on your table, if you didn't study them before arriving here, we do have for you the two sections that we'll be talking about today in case you want to take a look at those. And so we're making changes to these two rule sections, the incremental hydro rule and the renewable energy credit rule. And so today you really want to have the folks in the room and on Skype tell you what?
Well, not to be I don't want to sound like we've already figured out everything, but we do feel like this is, even though there are a lot of parts of this law where, we're going to be kind of wandering around to figure out the right place to get to. For these changes, at least to us, they look pretty straightforward. And so that's why we came in today with language already in front of you that you can look at and see whether you think we got it right. We have even just, since the law was passed, sometimes we'll get a question and think we know the answer and realize that we didn't get it quite right. And one reason for that is that the federal incremental hydro portion, the legislature actually made provisions around that in 2 or 3 different places. Liz Klump is grinning right now because she knows that, like I've given her 3 answers to the same question, and they were right, and then they were wrong, and then they were right. There was a lot of confusion, And so what we tried to do in the draft language is pull those provisions together into one particular place so that Liz doesn't have to go around to everybody in the room and tell them how to read the law correctly. So it's not just absolutely copy and paste that we're doing, but it is trying to capture in one subsection of the rule all the provisions that relate to the federal incremental hydro and do that accurately and completely. And then on the renewable energy credit part, that's a change that we're, in the legislation itself, we were trying to clarify and draw together some of the provisions that were in the statute before, but without making any substantive changes, and the important things like what years of electric generation are eligible for different fuel types and things like that. So the legislature tried to clarify without making substantive changes, and we're trying to incorporate that into our rules too. One thing that we had found in the past was that people could read the statute really closely and never quite figure out that hydro could only be used for compliance within the year that it was generated. And so that's one thing that we want to say more clearly so that people can find it easily when they're working on their compliance.
So that leads in great to the next question. So can you talk in more detail about how these changes affect the way utilities use hydro to comply with the Energy Independence Act?
Yeah, so once we get these rules in place, and I mean, you know, so starting in 2020, the hydro, the incremental generation from efficiency improvements that are made to the federal hydro system, the projects that are marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration, those will be eligible resources for compliance with the Energy Independence Act, starting with the 2020 compliance year. It's not a huge amount of generation, but it's significant, and for particular utilities, it'll make a big difference in how they comply. Some of the utilities will have enough incremental generation from their federal power receipts that they, like the jump that goes from this year when it's a 9% target to a 15% target next year, they may have that entire additional amount that they can meet by using this federal hydro that's newly eligible. And, you know, other utilities might be off of the increased amount that they need. So it will make a big difference for the utilities in their compliance in 2020 and how they get to that higher 15% standard.
So for renewable resources other than hydro, are there any substantive changes being proposed?
No. This, if we have our language right, we are more clearly, laying out some of the rules around vintage and things like that. But we're not making any substantive changes. Now, resources other than hydro are used for compliance with the Energy Independence Act.
So, pretty solid draft, I think. What feedback are you looking for from the folks in the room on Skype?
Yeah, well, I think it's, people may have questions about exactly what the law did, what was changed in the legislature. And so there may be some learning that we need to do as a group about how this rule language implements the statutory change. So we may get some questions and discussion about that. And then there may be, the words that we've written down in terms of draft language. Sometimes when you write that, you know really well what it means, but then somebody else can look at it and help you figure out that, it wasn't as clear as you thought it was. So not really trying to get 55 people wordsmithing, 11 lines of text, but we do want to make sure that you understand that we're open to suggestions about how we've drafted this implementation language.
So do you think it would be useful to have a few minutes just to kind of read through the material in front of you and then engage in a little table conversation and come up with some questions for Glenn? Does that sound like something that might be workable for everybody? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and give you a couple of minutes just to read through it. Does anybody need more than like a couple of minutes to read through it? Okay. And then we'll just invite you to have a conversation with your tables about kind of what you might think about to ask Glenn or share.
And what would you have the remote Skype callers do?
In 2030,
I mean, that's the only thing I'm just wondering. As Glenn said, is there an ability to be a little clearer about we have to use hydro in the year? It's included in here. I know, I'm just saying, it is still a little bureaucratic. Okay, you get somebody 5 years from now, comes in and doing this,
I'm thinking maybe any
that was the only thing.
I'm gonna
Oh, no, or you could just say, resource must be almost related. I mean, I think well, here, I mean, you have to have, they look at like the Amazon Power. So you can't get it, you can't get credit for it. It's on
it's all determined after the fact. That email went out. Actual generation. There's an average. Per se, but average.
So if you want to wrap up your conversations.
Yes, but the next time transfer.
Right. Here you go. Right. Perfect. All right. So, who would like to have a conversation with Dr. Blackman first with their question or their thoughts? And just remember to talk loud, outdoor voice. Go ahead.
I'll start. Hi, Glenn. Quick question regarding, if you don't mind, I'll dovetail this with a CETA question. So I understand that an incremental hydro rec cannot be banked for EIA compliance. It has to be consumed in the year that it was produced. Assuming that I've produced more incremental hydro recs than I need for EIA compliance, will those recs be available for CETA compliance in the 20% alternative on 2030?
Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, so Paul from Grant asked whether, and it is really more a question about the 2030 greenhouse gas neutral standard and whether incremental hydro recs are eligible for that standard. And I don't think, I mean, this is a topic that we'll be hitting at a future workshop, but the preview is, yes, they are eligible. I mean, any hydro will be eligible toward that greenhouse gas neutral standard. If it's bundled with its electricity, it'll be eligible within the 80% portion. If the REC is unbundled from the generation, it can still be used within the 20% alternative compliance. And it'll all need to be tracked and verified using RECs retired that demonstrate compliance.
Hey, Dr. Blackman, remember, outdoor voice.
Sorry.
All right.
Well, if I may follow up on that, is a hydro rec unbundleable and then usable in either EIA or CETA?
Eric's question was whether a hydro rec may be unbundled. Our understanding is that, and what we've tried to capture in this draft language, is that under the Energy Independence Act, it can't be used for compliance unless it is bundled with the electricity as preserving existing requirements. Also, it can't be banked from one year to the next unless you actually physically bank it behind the dam, but that's another story. But then under the new law in 2030, the definition of a REC includes hydro, and it says that unbundled RECs can be used for compliance in that 20% portion. So our understanding is that unbundled hydro RECs can be used for compliance with the greenhouse gas neutral standard.
Have anything on the Skype? No questions on Skype?
Do we have any Skype questions?
There's a question back there.
Yeah.
Amanda.
Amanda with Renewable Northwest.
Remember, loud.
All right.
You think you're yelling and you're not.
Okay. I'm curious. Kelly feels like I'm yelling. I'm curious as to whether or not, Glenn, you feel as though this language captures the legislative discussion related to using renewable energy certificates for compliance with the Washington law, while there's an opportunity to sell underlying energy into California, a state that doesn't necessarily have the same REC retirement requirements as Washington.
I think that it accurately reflects the legislative language in the Energy Independence Act amendments themselves. There are other provisions that say that when you're using unbundled RECs for compliance with the greenhouse gas neutral standard, that you can only do that if it doesn't result in double counting. But that double counting provision doesn't apply to Energy Independence Act RECs. And so we are not trying to do anything with double counting in this set of rules. We're going to work on that with the UTC, the work group type setting, to figure out the solution to that or the greenhouse gas neutral standard.
And is there not a concern about essentially complying with CETA through EIA RECs as well? Like part of the purpose of the streamlining was to create some situations where there's kind of a twofer for utilities who are complying with both. Does that not become a concern because of the streamlining?
I don't know. Maybe we can hang on to that idea for the streamlining discussion later this morning, brainstorming what we're going to do. Not that we'd really get to an answer on that, but at least we can put it down as something to look at as we're trying to streamline these two laws.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead.
Hey, Glenn. Just a quick question. In the current WAC, there was very specific standards for how you figure out what your incremental hydro is if you're a utility with hydro generation. Is there going to be any sort of expectation that Washington State is going to look over BPA's shoulder when BPA says this is the amount of incremental hydro, or are we simply going to accept BPA's numbers?
Could you repeat again?
Yeah, so Nicholas's question is, I guess whether the incremental generation calculations that EPA does comply with the Washington rule.
Well, are we simply going to accept the numbers BPA provides? Liz Klump earlier this morning sent out a spreadsheet with estimated incremental hydro numbers, and I have no knowledge or understanding of how they actually develop those. And are we going to figure that out, or are we simply going to say these are the numbers provided by EPA and we accept them?
The utilities that use incremental hydro from federal projects can only use the amounts that comply with Washington law and Washington rules. And so if EPA, their calculations would need to be consistent with Washington rule on incremental hydro. And we're actually in the process of confirming that that's the case right now. EPA has submitted advisory opinion applications for 6 projects, I believe. It's either 5 or 6, showing the calculations that they have made, that they've already used in Oregon. The comment period on that has now run, and so we'll be doing our evaluation to, confirm that those calculations are consistent with Washington requirements.
And one last follow-up, if you do in fact confirm it, then utilities don't have to do anything on their own to basically assert that, yeah, these do in fact qualify.
That's right. It'll show up on the rec, and it'll say Washington eligible for a certain percentage, and should be an easy path through the auditor's office with that particular topic.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
John Rockland with Avista. So, Glenn, as you're aware, there's sort of a unique provision as it relates to residential exchange credits provided to IOUs, where it's not really bundled with the power. It's more the credit and the environmental attributes associated with that. That doesn't appear to be reflected in the language. I presume that's because that's unique to IOUs, and will that be dealt with commission rulemaking? Is that why it's not reflected in here?
It's not addressed in our rules because our rules in virtually every case don't apply to investor-owned utilities. And so, and that provision is specific to investor-owned utilities. And so, Mr. Rector will be taking care of that one, I see. I hope.
Yes.
He will. I just heard it. Thank you
Would you
for
like
sitting
the
right
floor?
here, Andrew.
That's why I did it.
That's great.
So we do have a Skype question that's come in.
Great.
So the Skype question is from Rebecca Smith. Is the spreadsheet on incremental hydro forecast just referenced going to be publicly available?
So you want me to answer that?
Please, this is Liz Clark from EPA.
So anyone who's worked in the legislative session for about, I don't know, last 4 or 5 years would have, I see shaking of hands as from Renewables and Energy Coalition. So totally, if you want me to send it to you, it's just a forecast. When we do, when we actually produce RECs at the end of the year for incremental hydro, because this is an eligible resource in Oregon and has been for several years, we base it on actual hydro output during that calendar year. So what we've shared, just as a point of reference, is a forecast for low, water, and average year. Shared it externally before, and I'm happy to do it again. Send me an email. Thanks.
And BPA for the federal projects uses what those of you in this room who know what the different methods are, they use the method 2, which is the percentage factor. So every year with it's a lot of water or a little water, it's a fixed percentage number. That's what they have used in Oregon. That question came from Oregon, so we're in a little bit of a circle here. They've submitted their the same calculations that supported their Oregon numbers to us for us to review. But it is a percentage number that will be the result one way or the other.
So when you think about the documentation of incremental hydropower proposed language, anything else you just really need Glenn to hear from you about on that portion of this workshop? Because we're working.
Yes.
Steve Taylor from College PD. There's just a question on the wording of power marketed by BPA versus power sold by BPA. Do you see that as having a difference in terms, or do they mean the same?
Yeah. So Steve's question was about in the statute where the federal incremental hydro talks about power that's marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration.
2A.
In our rules, we try to say a little more directly what that meant, and that is that it's a purchase sale transaction where Bonneville is the one selling it. One reason we did that is that we did get some questions about where people, in their mind, they thought of marketing as advertising. Well, BPA advertises power from my independent hydro facility, then would that count? No, that's not what it meant. And we knew that the word marketed came from federal power marketing agencies and federal law stuff, and we're just trying to make it a little clearer. And what it means in this context is that BPA is selling power to one of the eligible utility or qualifying utilities.
Thanks. Anything else on the hydropower language?
Yes.
We really need Dr. Blackman.
Question.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna kick myself ass.
This is Bill Lemon, Stonebridge Securities.
Your slice customer.
Are hydro incremental improvements
where you're remarketing
privately owned?
Power from BPA that's over the amount you need to serve your load. Because it's a good water year. What do you do with the RECs associated with that portion of power that's remarketed?
They could be part of the transaction when you're remarketing it. So that instead of selling power of unknown source, you're selling hydropower, and your purchaser may find that to be of value. The RECs can also be used in a voluntary program, that doesn't have any kind of bundling requirement. I'm not. No other ideas are coming up for me about what you might do with those RECs that you can't use for EIA compliance.
So the answer to your question you're giving, or the answer you're giving is, if you ended up, BP had a really big water year, and your slice gave you an extra 10% power that's above your load. And you can't market power from BPA that's dedicated to your load, but if you're a slice customer, you might get excess power. And that, let's say that that 10% of RECs, since this percentage would not, you couldn't apply those to your customers unless you unbundled and sold it as just generic power. Is that what you have to do?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I guess so. I do. One of the things that we've found most challenging is to make sure that we get the language right about that you can't, under the statute, you can't resell federal hydro to another utility for its compliance with the Energy Independence Act. And so I do hope we've faithfully recorded that in the rule. But beyond that, any other resale opportunities of either the bundle power or the RECs or the power only, that's outside the scope of our rules. That's.
So Glenn, if we were to put a parking lot item up there, or a bike rack item, what would you have it be?
I don't know. Nicholas, is there a pending issue that you want to
Put on the bike rack?
on the?
At this point, I'd say no.
No,
Okay.
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 So
We do have a question on the phone, so I sent Brittany in the hallway to try to communicate so we can take it off mute. I don't know. Can you hear us on Skype? Do you want to pose your question on the phone?
Yes, this is Bill Lemon. Can you hear me?
We need to turn up the volume, so just bear with us for a moment. We can barely hear you.
Okay.
Try that.
Okay, this is Bill Lemon, Stonebridge Securities. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, my question is, are hydro incremental improvements from privately owned facilities exempt from these special requirements or uniquely prohibited from eligibility for credit?
Thank you for that question. For those in the room, I just happen to have a visual. I tend to recycle my folders. And so what I'm holding are qualifying utilities. It's not marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration. And it's not eligible, if they were to make an improvement to their project to increase the amount of generation, it would not be eligible under the Energy Independence Act. However, it would be eligible under the greenhouse gas neutral standard when that comes into effect.
Is there a particular reason for this discrimination?
I will let you ask your elected representative or senator about that.
All right. So the next section that we wanted you to take a look at, the proposed language, was around the eligible renewable resources and RECs for compliance. And I think the conversation's all been a little interwoven.
Yeah, it has.
On that language, is there anything that you all talked about or that you've been thinking about, that you read, that you really want to make sure Dr. Blackman hears from you in our next 13 minutes on this section? Don't all rush. Oh, wait, we have a question back there. Go ahead.
Ms. Kelly, I just want to clarify your response to the previous question to make sure I understood your answer. If there are incremental improvements from privately owned dams, those do count.
Under the greenhouse gas neutral standard in the new law. But under the existing Energy Independence Act, hydro has to be owned either by one of the 18 qualified utilities,
Okay.
or it has to be marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration.
Got it, yeah.
So I asked Glenn if he had any questions for you before we go into a break about this rule workshop.
I guess my only question would be whether, if I said that if you do have any written comments that you wanted to make on this language, could you get those to us by September 6th? So that we can keep this process moving. Does that seem like a reasonable date to do that?
And we have on your agenda, there's the email and the date for that.
Yeah, so Comments by email are fine. We published this in Word format, so that if you want to, do inline editing, you're welcome to do that and send it to us in that form. We'll look for any of that on September 6th and move along because we do want to get these in place this calendar year. Thank you.
Go ahead. So this is Deborah Reynolds from the Commission, Utilities and Transportation Commission with staff. And I just want to poll the room since there's so many people in here. I'd like to know the answer. How many people are actually using method 3 for incremental hydro? One. Okay. Thank you. That's all I wanted to know.
Oh, go ahead.
Michelle, you had a...
Yes, I'm Michelle with Mason PUD 3. As far as the overall process, I'm having a little hesitation in regards to the piecemeal approach, picking a section, working on it, having it approved, and working on other sections concurrently to get it done. I understand as far as timing, that's optimal because it'll help us get through the process maybe faster than otherwise. But I wonder if that if there's going to be winners or losers at the end, if we're not like looking at a full package. And I just thought that I'd throw out, is there a possibility that we can work on a section, do our due diligence, and set it aside instead of going through the official approval process until we have a full package to then approve?
Yeah. Did everybody hear Michelle's question? Okay. And Michelle, I think the approach that we're working on for the big body of rules is really consistent with what you're suggesting. And I'll talk more about this at the end, but we are just about ready to publish a more detailed implementation plan. It still is not going to be really detailed, but our plan is to take some discrete elements of the bill, discuss them in a group